Okay, maybe investing the whole country's assets in Dogecoin wasn't the best move. No need to point fingers here, but the treasury's empty, the whole country is broke, the people are demanding supplies, and creditors are at the door. There's only one thing left to do: declare bankruptcy. But what happens when a country declares bankruptcy exactly? Most people have probably only heard of bankruptcy in terms of businesses and individuals, such as when a beloved local food chain closed up shop. Rest in peace, steak and ale, your lunch specials won't be forgotten. Or when Uncle Billy's gambling debts got a little bit too high and his whole family had to throw in the towel on their payments. But those people rarely have too much power to determine the terms of their bankruptcy, and the banks usually make sure they get as much as they can before their debt is wiped clean. National bankruptcy is a very different matter, because who has more power than the actual head of the state? A country's bankruptcy is actually called sovereign default, and it basically boils down to the country no longer saying, "I'm good for it, man, the check's in the mail," and switching to, "Actually, I'm not good for it, and you can't make me pay." The government usually owes a lot of money to both domestic and foreign debtors, and they simply announce that they're defaulting on the debt and no more payments will be coming. They can publicly repudiate their debts or just stop paying and let everyone figure out what happened as the cash stops coming. But what could bring a country to these dire straits? Many countries run a national debt. Most are at least able to make consistent payments, even if in some countries the debt only seems to go up. But if you're paying the older creditors first and making payments in a timely fashion, then that's just the cost of doing business. Even so, multiple things can cause a debt to spiral out of control. And once a country's gross national product goes down enough, the interest on the debt becomes incredibly daunting and the country enters terminal debt, when the payments don't equal the interest and the debt keeps going up, even without borrowing something new. Then the only way out is to simply flush the debt. But circumstances can sometimes make things much worse. Many of the countries that default on their debts are the architects of their own misery. They're making poor investments, they didn't take enough care of their own financial sector, and they lent money to the wrong people. A history of this behavior can lead to a poor credit history, which makes it harder to get future loans. But outside factors can also cause debt to spiral out of control, such as when a major part of the market the country relies on is disrupted. If your country has one major export, a bad season for crops or a disaster in the shipping sector can throw a whole year's profits out the window. And then there's the danger of inflation, which can devalue a nation's currency, and that means $1 pays off a much smaller portion of the debt than usual. And that was never more clear than in 2020, when the entire world shut down due to COVID-19. Whole countries saw their economies grind to a halt. Millions of people were out of work, and many countries saw no other way to keep public order than to print an enormous amount of money for relief efforts. This caused heavy inflation in multiple countries that the world is still dealing with, and even today we see major shipping delays due to cities suddenly locking down and halting commerce in its tracks. The US hasn't had to default on any of its debt due to the pandemic. Its coffers are way too deep for that, but it hasn't stopped economists from looking nervously at the charts. But there's another reason nations might default on their debts. It's good old politics. Many countries racked up extensive amounts of debt when they were under colonial rule or had more powerful nations that set the terms of trade. The national debt is a source of resentment for the people, and when a new populist government takes charge, be it through an election or a revolution, one of the first things they do is declare a new constitution complete with the power to discharge the national debt. There's a lot of celebrating in the streets, followed by a lot of hard questions about what exactly that means for the future trade deals. In this case, there are two primary kinds of state bankruptcy. The first is insolvency. It's the more common of the two, usually a situation where the state has hit rock bottom and would be devastated by trying to pay off its entire debt. This is usually a combination of heavy public debt, lower tax revenue due to high unemployment, a declining stock market, and a public that would revolt if harsh austerity measures were instituted. So the government basically announces they won't be able to pay off their full debt, and they try to negotiate a settlement that will either forgive some of their debts or allow them to pay them off at a slower rate. But some states are in an even worse fix. Illiquidity is when a state is in a more serious immediate financial crisis and can't liquidate assets fast enough to even meet its interest or principal payments in the next cycle. This is an imminent default and usually requires a full halt of payments until enough assets are freed up. While this might seem more serious, it's also often much more temporary, and states often try to negotiate a temporary halt without asking for their full debt to be discharged. The tricky part is that it's not easy to prove whether or not this is genuine. But in thorny political climates, another X factor emerges. Post-revolution, or an election that might as well have been a revolution, and some states not only try to stop paying their debts, they might take the property of the people that they owe money to. This is a concept called odious debt, which states that debts incurred by a despotic regime are the responsibility of the regime rather than the country. While this is intended to relieve a people free of a dangerous government of its obligations, it can be used in other less conspicuous ways, such as when the Confederate States not only disavowed their debts to the Union, but seized a military fort belonging to the federal government. But there's no such thing as a free lunch. So what actually happens when a country calls it quits on its debts? For civilians in the United States, there's usually a structured process to clear the debts and get back into good standing. For individuals and businesses who have hit rock bottom and need a fresh start, the most common type is Chapter 7, which is basic liquidation. The debtor signs on the dotted line, their assets are seized by the authorities and liquidated and used to pay off as much of their debts as possible. It's unlikely that any business that declares this will still be around unless they're purchased, and any individual who declares Chapter 7 will likely be forced to forfeit any significant assets, including their house in many cases. Of course, it's good to be a big gun in some situations. Say you're a powerful businessman or an individual who made some questionable investments. That darn Dogecoin again, maybe. Your income stream has gone bust. You're heavily in debt. But, it's only a little while before you're back on top. And that's when it's time to declare Chapter 11, aka the rich man's bankruptcy. This is a rehabilitation or reorganization bankruptcy most commonly used by businesses. The company undergoes a significant financial reorganization and may have to sell off some assets, but remains functional as it repays its debt. Some of the biggest names in business have declared bankruptcy multiple times, including a certain former president. And for unusual cases, the government has a plan as well. Chapter 9 is reserved for municipal bankruptcy, when a town or a city goes bankrupt and needs to get out from under state or federal debt. This usually involves a monitor retooling their finances, but it's rare for a municipality to simply go away. Chapter 12 is a special bankruptcy dispensation for family farmers and fishermen that's likely to keep their assets that allow them to make a living. And then there's Chapter 15, which handles complex cases of international debt and allows cooperation with foreign bankruptcy courts. But how do you enforce a bankruptcy ruling against a whole country? The answer is, in most cases, you don't. National bankruptcies really aren't arranged bankruptcies but simple defaults on the debt. Anything that happens beyond that is more of a question of diplomacy and what the country that's defaulting can agree to based on their assets and their national climate. And while it might feel like the right thing to do for a country drowning in debt, the consequences of a sovereign default can be nasty. Right away, they start feeling the impact in more ways than one, and it can sometimes make a bad situation worse. But the problems don't stop there. For one thing, the creditors are hit immediately, and this can create a cascading effect. If a creditor has lent a significant amount of money to a country and it gets defaulted on, it affects the creditor's ability to lend out money to other clients. When it comes to a national scale, this can mean many countries go without vital assets. This is why repaying creditors in some form is usually the first step in attempting to resolve a sovereign default, and brings a lot of people to the negotiating table. Creditors often accept a lowball offer from the defaulting country to get what they can, although sometimes they hold out for a change in government to try to get a better deal. But that can come with a major risk, and it hits the state harder than anyone. The state might dismiss its financial obligations when it defaults, and that frees up a lot of money in the coffers. But the good times don't last, if they ever start. Few things will hurt a state's reputation with its creditors more than a default, which might make it next to impossible to get future loans. Not only that, but it can cause serious diplomatic consequences if the state owes heavy debts to other countries. In the best of circumstances, it might make it harder to trade with those countries in the future. In worse scenarios, the value of the state's currency in international affairs might go out the window, and the leadership could find themselves ostracized. And this can trickle down to the citizens badly. If the state defaults on its debt, the leadership might think this would resolve its financial problems. In reality, it turns out to be anything but rosy. The state still has empty coffers and limited assets, the people have needs, and the government might be toppled if they fall down on their basic duties. This often leads to the government ordering the printing of more money, which solves the immediate issue but then leads to heavy inflation and hurts the country even more in international trade as their currency is devalued. In moderate situations, this makes the cost of imports higher. In worse cases, like in Zimbabwe, it can result in bizarre scenarios, like people paying with wheelbarrows of near-worthless currency to buy food. And this can create a cascading effect. If the state defaults on all of its debts, including domestic debts, banks might have to write down massive debts and cause a banking crisis. This then spins out into a larger economic crisis as people panic and withdraw their money from the banks. The stock market tumbles, and a panic leads to a panic as the public fears make a bad situation worse. As the currency decreases in value and faith in the government does as well, the country is more likely to suffer through heavy unemployment, austerity, and criminal activity. But the consequences of a sovereign default depend heavily on the prestige of the country. Philip II of Spain was a powerful king in the 1500s, but financial skill was not his best asset. He wound up defaulting on a debt 4 times between 1557 and 1596, and each time the full hit wasn't taken by the Spanish crown, but by the powerful Fugger banking company in Germany, which had heavy investments in the Spanish crown. With no way to enforce a judgment against a powerful monarch with the Western world's mightiest armada, the Fuggers took the loss and eventually folded, ending a financial empire that spanned centuries, leading to the banking world being thrown into chaos. And in more modern times, it's common for countries to get in over their heads. The 1800s was a chaotic time as many former colonies gained their independence from the world powers and had to sort out their economies for the first time. That included several Latin American countries who went to the London bond market to get loans. They quickly found their debt spiraling as the interest racked up. But as the bondsmen mainly wanted to get their money back, they were open to negotiating the loans and setting up long-term repayment plans, and both sides kept the opportunity for future deals wide open. But 100 years later, new problems would emerge. In the 1920s, as a financial crisis hit the globe, most famously with the Great Depression in the United States, many countries started instituting protectionist policies. Tariffs rose, international trade decreased, and that unbalanced many countries' economies. Those that relied heavily on exports to fill their coffers found themselves struggling to pay off their debts. Most notably, Chile, in 1932, hit terminal debt when its scheduled repayments were higher on average than their entire exports. However, the world would soon have much bigger concerns. World War II was coming. But even in the modern day, major nations can go bankrupt. The entire world was rocked by a massive financial crisis again in 2007 and 2008 that left very few countries unaffected. However, one country which suffered more than many others was Greece, which suffered the longest recession of any advanced economy to date, and it devastated just about every area of life. The government debt rose rapidly, investors lost confidence in the Greek economy, and the government had to raise taxes a whopping 12 times. Not surprisingly, that led to significant social unrest, ranging from massive protests to violent riots. The government quickly tried to restore order by getting bailout loans from multiple groups, including the International Monetary Fund. And that should take care of things, right? The government of Greece tried to renegotiate its way out of the debts, getting private banks to agree to a 50% cut on the value of their debts. This was a debt relief of 100 billion euros, and it didn't do much good. The government was still massively in debt. They proposed new austerity measures to repay their obligations, but the public rejected them in referendums. The crisis dragged on and on until 2015, with Greece ultimately defaulting on its International Monetary Fund loan, the first developed country to ever do so. This caused stocks worldwide to tumble, people worrying that Greece might pull out of the European market, and options were limited for relieving the crisis. You can't get blood from a stone, so Greece was able to negotiate new terms for many of its debts. The overall debt is still high, but by 2021 they were selling 30-year bonds again for the first time since the financial crisis. Of course, to resolve a debt crisis you have to have a country wanting to pay. Venezuela had been a thorn in the side of the United States and its allies for well over a decade. First, the fiery left-wing leader Hugo Chavez took control and sought to create an anti-American bloc in South America. He was succeeded by his protege, Nicolas Maduro, who became more authoritarian and increasingly isolated Venezuela from the global economy, racking up the country's debt. As its debts arose, the economy crashed, and things only seemed to be getting worse. Sure enough, 2017 it defaulted on its debts, and creditors around the world struggled to figure out their next move. Is there any way to actually force a country to repay its debts? Bondholders do have power in the global market, and if enough holders of a bond call in their chips, it can create a cascading effect. But that's not always possible, especially in a country like Venezuela, where they likely do not have the money on hand to pay even a fraction of their debts. As the grace period faded and the Maduro regime showed no intention of paying up, the country was suffering far more than its debtors. It had struggled to provide enough food and medicine for its citizens, resulting in massive lines for basic goods. But Venezuela does have one asset that could help dig itself out of its debt hole. Under international law, creditors do have the ability to seek relief for their debt by seizing the assets of the country that owes them money. This is only feasible if the country has a significant amount of exports that can be taken from ships and ports, and Venezuela does have one in particular: oil, and lots of it. It's their primary export, and one that maintains its value and helps them forge diplomatic relations with other America-skeptic nations. So why haven't creditors called in their chips and held Venezuela accountable for its debt? Because that could make the situation much worse, cutting off the country's primary income stream and making the country's humanitarian crisis spiral out of control. But what happens if things do escalate? Of course, foreign debtors have one more option for trying to recoup their debt from a country that's refusing or unable to pay it: declare war. This is usually a last resort for creditors for a number of reasons. For one thing, a successful invasion is likely to devastate the invaded country even further, making it harder to recoup the assets. And if the country doing the invading puts the needed resources into it, it might cost a lot of money, potentially much more than the actual debt. Finally, this would worsen the relationship between the two states and make negotiations harder. So the only way to force concessions out of the debtor might be a costly internationally condemned occupation or even a full annexation of the country. All of these options might cause so much hardship in terms of money and lives lost that the creditor nation might be more likely just to write off the debt. But that's not to say it hasn't happened. When the Confederate States seceded from the U.S. in 1861, the Union was split. Some wanted to invade and take back the southern half of the United States, while others thought the issues between the two regions were irreconcilable, and a nation divorce might be the best approach to ending the conflict. That debate still largely ended when the South attempted to seize Fort Sumter, and then went on to be completely defeated and reincorporated into the United States, although there was a silver lining. After the United States ratified the 14th Amendment, they repudiated the debts held by the Confederate States. But in most cases, the countries are motivated by a number of factors. Why do companies repay their debts when they go bankrupt instead of just wiping the slate clean? The first reason is usually fear. A country that has defaulted on its debts will make a lot of powerful enemies and might want to avoid long-term consequences. Yes, there is the risk of military intervention, but the country could also find its assets seized abroad by other foreign courts or find its currency blacklisted from international markets. Either of these punitive economic measures could destroy their economy and could cause more damage and have longer-lasting effects than even a war. But sometimes countries have to apply to the debtor's better interests. There are few things more valuable in international relations than your reputation, and many creditors leverage that to get their money back. It's the classic puzzle of the carrot and stick. If you threaten the debtor with harsh reprisals, you might get the money back or you might get nothing and burn your connections with the country. That's why many countries choose instead to work with a country that went bankrupt, arranging a payment plan and even providing more immediate relief to help the country get back on its feet. By eschewing retaliation of any kind, the creditors invest in the country's future and put themselves in prime position to benefit after recovery. It's basically a national Chapter 11, but what about the national equivalent of a Chapter 7? When a company files Chapter 7, they usually cease to exist altogether. The company's debts are discharged and their assets are liquidated to pay off their debts. You can't simply abolish a country, or can you? It's pretty rare for a country to be abolished in the modern day, although there was one example that made news around the world, the Soviet Union. The massive empire collapsed in the early 1990s and had a massive debt when it did. Russia endured, but much of the empire split into new countries that had to start from scratch without a powerful nation pulling their strings. And in the immediate aftermath, creditors around the world had to scramble to figure out who owes what. While some tried to get payment from the newly democratic state of Russia, their finances were not in the best shape. New nations like Ukraine, Estonia, Georgia, and Kazakhstan inherited some of the debt, but the chaos of trying to figure out the economics complicated any attempt to recoup most of the debt. So, no one's gonna put a for sale sign on the United States anytime soon, but is the country in danger of a default? Surprisingly, it's come rather close in recent years, but the culprit wasn't the war or a recession or a change in government. It was one of the oldest plagues of the US government: politics. The United States has a debt limit, capping the amount of money the government can borrow. The US frequently borrows money to pay money, so every few years they vote to raise the debt limit and move ahead with business as usual. Sounds like a healthy way to run an economy. But in recent years, Republicans have started to balk at the idea of raising the debt ceiling, causing legislative standoffs. More than once, the US has come within days of defaulting on its debt, which could cause financial earthquakes around the world. The US is seen as one of the bulwarks of the global economy, and if its debts can't be counted on, it would likely have a lot of people rethinking their financial portfolios. But hey, at least they're better off than steak and ale. Watch What If the US Paid Off Its Debt for an unlikely hypothetical, or check out this other video instead.